I've been thinking about Holy Communion a lot lately. I don't know about you, but I miss it. I miss sharing the bread and wine and receiving in faith the body and blood of Christ, the nourishment that comes through God's gift of grace in this tiny meal. It will still be some time until we can gather again, and even when we do, we'll be following some strict precautions for a while. Now, you may have heard that some congregations across the country have begun to worship together again. We're not ready to do that. Our region has been hit very hard by this virus, and it is still the responsible thing for us to do to remain closed for now. You may have also heard that some congregations are offering what they call virtual communion, in which you provide your own bread and wine at home, and then the pastor virtually consecrates them. Well, I understand why some congregations are doing that, but the ELCA Conference of Bishops has been very clear that this practice goes against their interpretation of the Lutheran Confessions, and they have strongly urged congregations not to engage in it, and we are following their guidance. I've been thinking about the history of Holy Communion in American Lutheranism. When this country was settled by Europeans, they brought their faith with them. For Germans and Scandinavians, this often meant Lutheranism. But what they didn't bring along was enough pastors. For many decades, there were far more Lutheran churches than pastors, and so many of these pastors became circuit riders, riding from one church to another on horseback. When the pastor was in town, you had communion worship. When he wasn't, worship was led by lay people, and communion was not shared. Over time, the idea of communion happening only once per quarter or so, when the pastor was there, that idea stuck in many Lutheran churches, even after the circuit rider days ended. But in the late 20th century, there was something of a revival in communion practices, and many, perhaps most, Lutheran congregations now celebrate communion every week again. Of course, that's not true right now, and hasn't been for 7 weeks or so. But there's an irony here. It used to be that we fasted from regular communion because we had no pastor. Well, now we do so because we have no congregation. So I was thinking about the connections between food and our faith. That's especially noticeable during this Easter season, because a great number of the stories of Jesus appearing to the disciples after the resurrection involve food. In the story of the walk to Emmaus, Jesus shares bread with 2 disciples. In another story, he proves he's not a ghost by asking them for food and eating a piece of baked fish right in front of them. In another, he appeared by the lakeside, and he called the disciples to a breakfast of bread and fish. And in another, he told Simon Peter, "Feed my sheep." None of these instances were Holy Communion, however. So it's clear that food is important to our relationship with Jesus, even beyond the Eucharist. And that reminded me of a special service that some of our sisters and brothers in Christ celebrate, a service called a love feast, or an agape meal. The United Methodist Book of Worship says this: "The love feast is a Christian fellowship meal recalling the meals Jesus shared with disciples during his ministry and expressing the community and fellowship enjoyed by the family of Christ. Although its origins in the early church are closely interconnected with the origins of the Lord's Supper, the 2 services became quite distinct and should not be confused with each other. The modern history of the love feast began when Count Zinzendorf and the Moravians in Germany introduced a service of sharing food, prayer, religious conversation, and hymns in 1727. John Wesley of the Methodists first experienced this among the Moravians in Savannah, Georgia, 10 years later. As Methodists immigrated to North America, they made love feasts an important part of early American Methodism. The love feast is most naturally held around a table or with persons seated in a circle, but it is possible to hold it with persons seated in rows. A church sanctuary, fellowship hall, or home is an appropriate location. One of the advantages of the love feast is that any Christian may conduct it. It seems to me that love feasts are the kind of worship that you can do at home, and it might just fulfill the craving for Holy Communion, at least in part. In one of my pastor mails this week, I will include an order for a love feast that you can use at home. I encourage you to try it. You could gather just with the people in your household, or you could use the telephone or video chat on your computer and involve other people as well. This doesn't really take the place of watching our online Sunday worship, but it might be a great addition to it. Let me know how it goes. I'd love to hear if this is a helpful resource for you.